Great. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you. Thanks for coming out early. We're so pleased to have Peter Orszag talking to us today, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Nice to see you, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
Recently, Peter announced that he's stepping down, so we're going to get into the reasons why as well. But first, Peter, can you talk to us about where we are in this economic recovery? So much debate right now from one camp who says we are rolling along and the recovery is moving along nicely.
Hopefully better than my microphone.
Right. And then, of course, another camp that says we could actually be headed for a double-dip recession. How would you characterize where we are right now?
Well, a few comments. First, I think it is important to just step back, and if this group had been gathered in late 2008, where we are today would have to be on the upper part of the distribution of possible outcomes, because I think it goes unremarked upon just how serious the situation was. We went from private sector borrowing of almost 30% of GDP in 2007, and to 2008 fell off a cliff. Real GDP was declining by 6% on an annualized basis. So while there may be some challenges, which I want to get to, we have to realize that having positive economic growth, having risk spreads back down to normal levels, and having the economy be, on the upswing, at least in terms of GDP growth, even if there's still lingering labor market problems, is a huge success that I think history will judge well. Now, in terms of the current situation, what I would say is that we've had some degree of softening. It's almost like over the past 6 months, the economy's gotten stronger, a little bit of softening over the past month or so. But several things are important to remember. First, this is normal. During a recovery, it's not always just constant improvement. You'll improve and then a couple steps back and several steps forward, and this is not to be, there's no surprise in it. I think the things that we need to be watching as we move forward, the economy has some self-propelling momentum now, but there are four forces that are drags that need to be monitored. The first is that the inventory cycle, as firms have started to build up their inventories again, will be coming off. That is to say, one of the things that happens as the economy starts to recover is that firms which had drawn down their inventories start to build them up again. That adds to economic activity. It added about 1.5% to economic growth during the beginning part of this year. By the end of this year, it will be adding 0. And so that's a drag on economic activity. The second thing is that the Recovery Act, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about because I think popular perception is much different from economist perception on the efficacy of the Recovery Act. It I think, has played a very substantial role in moving us from negative to positive economic growth. But its effects are tapering. And so while it added or it accounted for about 2.5% to 3% of GDP this year, it's going to fall to 1 to 1.5% of GDP next year, and even less than that in 2012. So that's another drag on the economy as that's coming off. Third thing is that state and local governments are facing $140 billion in deficits, and the steps that they will have to take to rectify those deficits will be drags on the economy. And then finally, the situation in Europe, which has a complicated impact on the United States. The direct effect, something like 20 to 30% of our exports go to Europe. So as their economy weakens, that has an adverse effect on our exports, as does exchange rate changes over time. But I think the more important question is financial market linkages and possible contamination effects. And one of the striking things is that we have actually been benefiting indirectly from the turmoil in Europe, because the flight to safety has caused the 10-year bond yield to go south of 3%. So bottom line, much better off than I think would have been reasonable to predict at the end of 2008. The economy is growing, and that is a very positive thing, but there are some forces that need to be monitored.
It sounds like we're going to have the second half of the year that's going to be tough.
Maybe, but the way I would put it is that it will be slow growth. The central expectation is for positive growth that is not gangbusters, but that is positive. And I think the risk of a double dip recession, while it's always difficult to dismiss risks entirely, is not anywhere near the central expectation. I think the challenge that we face is not the risk of a double dip recession, but rather the risk of very sluggish growth over a significant period of time.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you mentioned inventories and the state of the state and local governments as well as Europe is what led me to believe that, we're not out of this yet, even though we are seeing growth. What is it going to take to actually see job creation?
Well, look, one of the things, just again, step back and review what happens during an economic recovery. The first thing that happens as the economy starts to pick up is that you see very, very rapid productivity growth. So output per worker goes up. That's the first stage, and we experienced very rapid productivity growth last year and into the early part of this year. The second stage is that temporary hiring and the work week increase. So you try to hire temporary workers and have your existing workers work longer. And we've been seeing that happening. And then the final stage is actually increases in employment. And we are moving into that third stage. At the end of 2008, again, private sector jobs were declining by 750,000 a month. They're now increasing. They've increased in each of the last 6 months. So that's a very substantial shift. It's unfortunately the case, though, that the employment growth is not as rapid as one would like yet, and that's going to take some time. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I think we would all agree that that moment in time at the end of 2008 felt really scary when Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy and the commercial paper market really froze up. Let's go back to the Recovery Act and the efficacy of it, because there has been some debate about how stimulative the Recovery Act in fact was. And of course, we are looking at night and day when you compare it to 2008, but some people also might say that the Federal Reserve had a big part in that, as well as, by the way, the stock market coming back, bottoming in March of 2009, making people feel richer. Talk to us about where the money has gone in terms of that Recovery Act. All right, a few comments on the Recovery Act. First, the typical academic critique against doing something like the Recovery Act is that Congress and the administration can never act quickly enough to make a difference. This so-called inside lag is much too long, and so it's not even worth trying. The Recovery Act is a dramatic example of where the system actually responded very rapidly. So that's the first point. Second point, in terms of the spend-out rates, the initial projection, and there was some skepticism, including in the media, about this when the Recovery Act was being enacted, was that 70% of the money would spend out by the end of this fiscal year, which ends at the end of September. That is going to happen. So 70% of the funds will be out the door by the end of fiscal year 2010. In terms of the economic impact, almost all of the credible analysis that I've seen, whether it's from the Congressional Budget Office, and let's actually just use the Congressional Budget Office as the arbiter, since I think they're widely respected as nonpartisan and good at this sort of thing. CBO's analysis suggests that the Recovery Act has been adding 2 to 3 percentage points to economic activity over the past several quarters. So out of that shift from -6 to something like +4% on real GDP growth. The economy was declining at 6% on an annualized basis at the end of 2008 into early 2009. A year later, it was increasing at roughly a 4% annualized rate. A significant component, not all of it, but a significant component of that can be traced to the impact on aggregate demand from the Recovery Act. I think, another way of putting it is, I think history will show that both in terms of getting it enacted, in terms of its economic impact, and I'd also note in terms of the relative absence of fraud and abuse. It is striking that in a program this novel and that big, in which you're trying to push money out the door relatively rapidly, we really haven't had the dramatic fraud that I think a lot of people feared would be a necessary price of a program this big and this rapid.
Why do you think there was such debate about this? I mean, looking at your tenure, you served a crucial role and continue to serve a crucial role in the Obama administration's cabinet, helping to pass 2 of the arguably most important legislative measures on record, $940 billion health care overhaul bill and the $787 Stimulus Act. And yet, even though these were two of the most important pieces of legislation, they also were among the most unpopular. When you look at poll after poll in the last year and a half demonstrating consistent pessimism. A June Gallup poll, 50% of respondents said that they wanted health care partially or completely repealed. Why do you think this is?
Well, I think there are a couple explanations, but I think that rather than dealing just even with those individual pieces of legislation, I think the real question is whether the American public has lost faith in the ability of government to deliver the things that the American public wants.
Maybe that's the overriding.
I think that's the overarching frame in which these various pieces of legislation, whether it's the Recovery Act or healthcare, are being evaluated. And there are several steps that we're taking to try to change that. In part, for example, I think a lot of Americans, I mean, it seems trivial, but a lot of Americans are used to more sophisticated information technology in their houses or at their private firms than in interacting with the federal government. So it's frustrating that when you go to make an appointment with the Social Security Administration, you can't do that online. There's a whole variety of things. I mean, that's one example. I think the technological changes in the media and the increasing polarization in viewpoints exacerbates this underlying distrust of government, if you will. And frankly, the unintended consequences of gerrymandering, where for any given polarization of the American population, the policymakers are even more polarized because of the way that, in particular, the House runs its elections, causes this people just to see people throwing mud at each other and distrust in government. And I think that colors whether folks think that the government's capable of stemming the tide on a dramatic economic downturn or delivering higher quality or helping to deliver higher quality and lower cost healthcare.
Talk to us about how we're going to get out of the hole that the country is in. We've seen...
Which one?
the deficit. You've been charged with funding the president's legislative agenda, juggling fiscal demands of two wars, arguably the worst economic environment ever, budgeting with an eye toward future spending. Where should the priorities be right now in terms of government? Should it be on continuing to stimulate a fragile situation or stopping spending?
Well, look, I think there's been this, frankly, a false debate that has arisen between the jobs versus deficit debate. The right policy combination is more support for the economy today when the unemployment rate is still above 9.5%, and more medium and long-term fiscal consolidation. Both sides should agree on that. So the furthest left has to acknowledge that we face a very serious medium and long-term fiscal problem, and if we don't address it, we are going to create a crisis eventually. Similarly, the harshest fiscal hawk has to acknowledge that the unemployment rate is still way higher than it should be, the economy still is not growing as rapidly as it should be, and additional support in the near term would be warranted. So we're having this kind of false debate. And then actually what's even more interesting is the debate then gets played out over very small pieces of legislation that will help many people, but won't have dramatic effects either on the short-term economy or on the long-term fiscal outlook, and yet becomes the embodiment of this false debate. What we need to do, look, let's talk about the deficit for a second. The deficit this year is going to be in excess of 10% of the economy, 10% of GDP. By 2015, we project under current policies with no change in policy, it will be about 5% of GDP. That's too high. I should also, by the way, quickly note, those numbers are hugely uncertain. So 5 years out, the 90% confidence interval is plus or minus 5% of GDP. So I should have said it will be somewhere between 0 and 10. And for those of you who haven't thought about this, just to pause for a second, because I think this is actually a very important point. The deficit is the difference between two very large numbers. So just in your mind, imagine that spending is $100 and revenue is $95. The deficit's $5. If revenue declines by only, say, 5%, by about $5, the deficit doubles from $5 to $10. So very small changes in one of these very big aggregates can have dramatic effects on the difference between the two, which is why you have this huge amount of uncertainty. Nonetheless, the central expectation is 5% of GDP. That's too high, and it needs to come down. It needs to be somewhere closer. Our fiscal goal is somewhere like 3% of GDP, which would stabilize debt as a share of the economy. The Fiscal Commission that we appointed is intended to get us part of the way there. And let me comment on, let me put it this way. There are, I think, two reasons why the conventional wisdom in Washington is too pessimistic about our fiscal outlook, and two reasons why it's too optimistic. The two reasons that it's too pessimistic are, first, I think that relative to the conventional wisdom, the Health Care Act, and perhaps we'll be able to talk about that too, the Health Care Act will do more to reduce our long-term fiscal gap if it's implemented well than the typical pundit gives it credit for. And just on that point for a second, the Congressional Budget Office last week came out with a new analysis of our long-term fiscal gap. Last year it said the fiscal gap was 8% of GDP over the next 75 years. That means we would have to raise revenue or cut spending by 8% of GDP over the next 75 years in order to stabilize our debt as a share of the economy, a massive gap. This year, you can back out from the numbers that CBO is assuming that if the Health Act is implemented, that gap falls from 8 to 6. So it falls by about a quarter. Furthermore, CBO turned off some of its effects after 2030. If you actually continued to implement the Act fully after 2030, it would fall more from like 8 to 5. So the Health Act, if it's fully implemented, would cut our long-term fiscal imbalance by somewhere between a quarter and a third, and maybe we could talk more about that. Second reason the conventional wisdom is too negative is that it completely discounts the impact of the Fiscal Commission and thinks it won't produce anything at all. And that's for two reasons. One is the complaint is it's not a statutory commission. We supported making a commission a statutory commission, having it embodied in law. And the second is that even this version of the commission won't produce any recommendations. And let me just deal with both of those briefly. The only difference between a statutory commission and the executive order commission that was created is the strength of the guarantee that if the commission issues a recommendation, that recommendation will be voted upon. In the statutory version, that was a law. The House and Senate had to vote on it. In the executive order version, we have a promise from Speaker Pelosi and Senator Reid that they'll vote on it. So OK, the promise is not as strong as a law, but that can't possibly be the biggest deal in the world. The second complaint then is that you need 14 out of 18 members of the commission in order to issue a recommendation. And while I think there is a lot of effort going into producing recommendations that would garner 14 out of 18 votes, some people think that's going to be extraordinarily challenging. The only thing I would say is, while that's the goal, and I hope and expect that they will be able to meet that, even if they don't, the two co-chairs could always come out with their own recommendation with 10 of the members of the commission. And I think that will have almost as much impact as the formal recommendation with 14 out of 18 involved. Now, a big so that's two reasons that the conventional wisdom's too pessimistic. On the other hand, the 10-year bond yield is now under 3%. It is extraordinarily challenging to get policymakers to want to act, members of Congress to want to act on our medium and long-term fiscal imbalance when financial markets are signaling no concern over our fiscal trajectory. So one of the challenges will be our political system does not deal well with gradual long-term problems. Our fiscal trajectory is a gradual long-term problem. And in the absence of financial markets being concerned about it, it is challenging to generate action. It's, again, another motivation for the commission. And finally, I think there's a lot of debate and question about the right mix of both for the medium term and the long term. This is one of the things the commission's struggling with, revenue versus spending. And that's another huge issue that makes it challenging to tackle this problem.
You said a lot of things, and I want to get back to healthcare
Sure.
in a moment. But what if we don't get the deficit down? What are the practical implications of 10% of GDP? And you said that you're looking at 5 or 6 years at 5%. But I remember you were saying before that you wanted it down to 3% of GDP. So what if we don't have success in the next 5-7 years in terms of truly making a dent in the deficit? Tell me about that crisis.
Well, one of the things that one would encounter is that if you are on an unsustainable fiscal course and do not act in time, when investor confidence shifts, the problem is things can go awry in such a horribly diverse set of ways that it's almost folly to try to predict the exact pathways. The point is we never want to be in that position.
So we'll have a market disruption.
You can have, the typical effects are significant effects on interest rates, on potential effects on the exchange rate, effects on investor confidence, on business confidence. And ultimately, the key thing is ultimately sharp pain for the economy and less maneuvering room to deal with things like what we just went through. Imagine, just for a second, imagine if we had no fiscal room to respond aggressively, whether through the TARP or through the Recovery Act, to the economic downturn that we experienced. We would have been in much worse situation.
Let me ask you this. Where is the most wasteful spending in your view? Talk to us about the low-hanging fruit. What could be cut to start truly making a dent?
Well, there are lots of things that can't be reduced in the discretionary part of the budget, but I think the important thing that people often don't realize is the agency budgets are not where the money is. Non-defense discretionary spending, which is most of what the way that folks see, the EPA, FBI, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, all those departments together amount to 4% of GDP. So if you reduce spending in that category by 5%, which would be a significant achievement, that's 0.2% of GDP. So it's significant, but it's not where the money is. The money is in our healthcare programs and in Social Security. And so I think the short answer to your question is the biggest opportunity for more efficiency in spending, I believe, is in healthcare. While there have been some questions raised about the research done at the Dartmouth the Wenberg Center, I think that research still suggests, and cross-country comparisons still suggest, and a variety of evidence still suggests, we have huge variation across the United States in the way that healthcare is practiced, and significant opportunities for improving outcomes and reducing costs, and that's where the money is.
Tell us about that. You said that longer term, the healthcare bill will, in fact, lower the deficit longer term. Give us the implications of the short term and the long term, and how specifically will it lower the deficit?
Okay, so I'm going to just base things off of the Congressional Budget Office analysis, specifically, and then I want to come back to a broader question. CBO said that the Health Act will reduce the deficit by 0.5% of GDP in the second decade of its existence. And then, as I just noted, the effects grow over time, and you can back out from the analysis that CBO put out last week that in net present value over the next 75 years, you're talking about 2 to 2.5, maybe even 3% of GDP in reduced fiscal gap from the Health Act. Now that's if it is fully implemented. So I think those numbers demonstrate a few things. First, by design, the effects grow over time. That was by design. Second, if you back out the specifics, most of the long-term deficit reduction is coming from two provisions in particular: the excise tax on high-cost insurance plans and the Medicare Payment Advisory Board. And let me pause on that and say, look, we face a huge increase in healthcare costs. There really are only three possible ways of addressing the increase in healthcare costs. One is consumer-directed health, so having consumers have more skin in the game. That can help a bit. And that's, by the way, the basis behind things like Paul Ryan's fiscal plan. That can help a bit, but you don't get as much traction from consumer-directed health as you would think because of two reasons. First, we are always going to provide deep insurance against high healthcare costs. That's the whole point of insurance. Second, most healthcare costs are in the high-cost cases. The top 25% of Medicare beneficiaries account for 85% of costs. So when you say consumer-directed healthcare, you are having more consumer skin in the game against only a very narrow base of overall healthcare spending, and you don't get as much traction as you think. Second possibility is rationing. Not politically viable, and I don't think where anyone wants to go. The third possibility is to recognize that, especially in those high-cost cases, most of the healthcare delivered in the United States is what your doctor or hospital recommends. Maybe not for the people in this room who are going on WebMD and doing your own research, but for most people, the healthcare, especially in those complicated high-cost cases, is what their doctor or hospital recommends. And therefore, you have to get at why is the doctor recommending this instead of that. And one of the key reasons is information, and another key reason is financial incentives. Right now, we have financial incentives for more care rather than better care. We need to, everyone, I think, agrees we need to be moving towards incentives for better care. The challenge is exactly how to do that. The legislation creates lots of mechanisms that will help us on that path, but the proof will be in the pudding. We actually have to follow the path, try all these experiments, and stick to the commitment to moving in that direction.
So you think that that's why healthcare is so much more expensive in this country than anywhere else, because of the incentives? Is that the reason? Why is it so much more expensive?
There have been a variety of studies done on that topic. I think the best one is actually from the McKinsey Global Institute, tracing through cost differentials. There are a variety of explanations, some of which, some of the popular explanations are false. So it is not the case, for example, that Americans at least measure, when the metric is measured in terms of healthcare costs, are less healthy than others. We do have more of some diseases, less of others. We're better at treating hypertension, so on and so forth. So that's not an explanation. Doctor salaries, insurance company profits, other popular explanations, most of those do show up, but they tend to be, they're not, the differentials aren't as massive as some of the popular descriptions would suggest. And one of the things that they do point to is much more technology diffusion in the United States than elsewhere. So MRIs per capita, for example, are much higher here than abroad. And one of the reasons is we have deep financial incentives for more technology in healthcare, even if it doesn't always work better than the alternative. So the key thing is, I think we should all be in favor of technological improvements and better healthcare, but more is not always better. That's the bottom line.
I think there was a session earlier in the festival about the fact that we have so many specialists in this country. And we really don't have enough doctors that sort of know our overall health, because we have an issue, we go to a specialist, and that obviously comes with a premium and it's more expensive.
One of the things that seems correlated with the variation within the United States. So again, you have parts of the United States that are delivering healthcare at 2 times the cost of other parts, even at our top medical facilities. So one of the things that's correlated with that is the ratio of specialists to primary care physicians. I think it's the Recovery Act, the Health Act included some modest provisions for expanding the primary care physicians. But we face a significant problem in that the majority of doctors graduating from medical schools are not going into primary care. And again, I think that's for 2 reasons. One is the financial incentives are stronger to go into specialties. And second, there's a cultural aspect, which is in medical school, it's not cool to go into primary care. And one needs to address both of those, I think.
Talking about budgeting, when you say the money is in healthcare, that's where the money is, as opposed to some of the other,
well, increasingly over time, yes.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a will? Is there truly a will in Congress to cut the entitlements? I mean, isn't this, at the end of the day, one of the biggest issues in terms of truly making a dent in the deficit?
Yes, and let me, one of the reasons, the president was very insistent on creating this payment advisory board, the Medicare Payment Advisory Board. So let me just describe that for a second, because I think it speaks to this issue. The Payment Advisory Board has more potential power than I think any institution that Congress has created in many years, if not decades. It is assigned the task of hitting out-year cost growth targets for Medicare, which, if we succeed in hitting, will produce significant, that 3% of GDP or so reduction in our long-term fiscal gap, which would be a massive accomplishment. The important point to realize is the advisory board puts forward recommendations. If those recommendations are ignored by the Congress, even if they're voted down by the Congress and then the president vetoes that bill, or if one house votes and the other house doesn't, they take effect. The default is the Payment Advisory Board's recommendations take effect. And in order to prevent that from happening, you'd have to have both houses of Congress vote them down and the president sign that bill rejecting the board's recommendations. This is a massive potential shift in how Medicare policy in particular is determined in the United States. Now, an institution can have lots of power on paper and then turn out to be a dud depending on the culture and reputation it develops. But in terms of its potential power on paper, there's very substantial change there that speaks to the question you were raising, because in a sense, Congress could...
So you think because of the Payment Advisory Board, then we will have the cuts that are necessary?
I think it's among the best, the most auspicious things that have happened in order to overcome the classic problem. Look, there are two problems in healthcare with the way that Medicare policy in particular is determined. And I'm not saying anything that Senator Max Baucus, the chairman of the Finance Committee, hasn't said himself. The first is that most members of the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee don't feel like they have the technical expertise to be setting the reimbursement rate for durable medical equipment. I mean, it's not what they, that's not their life experience, it's not what they do. Or it is what they do, but it's not what they had done. And the second thing is that the lobbying is intense. You have the durable medical equipment manufacturers being very interested in that narrow slice and very effective at guiding the congressional process. So one of the things that this Payment Advisory Board may be able to succeed in doing is moving a lot more of the decision making into a focus on what makes most sense for the medical system and for the American public, and a little bit less subjected to congressional lobbying.
Okay, so there may not necessarily be the will that is necessary to cut the entitlements, but this board is going to go a long way in terms of making change.
Could. Again, on paper, it looks very good. And I think a key question, I mean, one of the things that's fascinating is if you look at different institutions, why do some develop into powerful entities and others don't? I like to say that the Congressional Budget Office, if you looked at the Congressional Budget Office on paper, if the Congressional Budget Office was evaluating the Congressional Budget Office, it would say it's a completely feckless organization because its director is chosen by the Congress, its budget is chosen by the Congress, its director can be dismissed by a simple majority vote in either house. You look at that institutionally and you say that thing is never going to amount to anything. It has amounted to a lot, in part because Alice Rivlin and others built up a reputation for independence and integrity that has persisted to this day. So similarly, this thing has a lot of power on paper, but a lot will depend on who the first director is and how the initial decisions are made and kind of how it develops over time.
So when you're looking at cuts, we truly need to cut that part of spending in order to make a dent in the deficit. Fair statement?
If we don't succeed in changing the rate at which healthcare costs are projected to grow, there is nothing else that we can do for our fiscal outlook that's going to matter very much, period.
So let's talk about, putting that aside, let's talk about the raising revenue part of the story. Do you think that we could truly make a dent in the deficit by raising taxes only on the highest earners?
Well, you can make a significant dent. I mean, the proposals that the administration has put forward, roughly $1 trillion in deficit reduction over the next decade, do end the upper income tax cuts that were enacted in 2001 and 2003. So there's a significant component. I think one of the things the Commission on purpose is doing, or one of the things the Commission was created to do, is take a fresh look at the fiscal course we're on and at the tax code and evaluate whether the two mesh.
Do you think it's likely that we'll have to see taxes go higher on everyone in order to get the appropriate amount of revenue?
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, this is what the Commission's trying to evaluate, so time will tell.
As far as tax policy, what do you think of that tax? What do you think about all of the ideas out there?
This is the part of the interview where I just go cold silence.
But you've been talking so much, and everybody's been enjoying it so much.
You don't think that was on purpose? No, okay.
All by design. No, seriously, let's try to have an informed discussion about tax policy and how policy ought to change. What are some good ideas out there in your view?
I actually don't think it's going to be productive for me to speculate right now on the right mix of revenue options. I will say that I think we have a fundamental challenge that we face, which is that historically revenue has been about 18% of the economy, federal revenue. that historical period was not, and that number is often cited, that historical period occurred when we did not have an aging population like we now have, or we had an aging population, but it hadn't aged yet. And secondly, healthcare costs had not come to dominate, increasingly dominate the budget. So that historical norm, I think there is a fundamental tension between that historical norm that has existed in the United States for several decades and the future in which Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security in particular increase substantially as a share of GDP, and that creates just a, one side or the other has to give.
What about the rest of the world? I mean, a lot of people talk about the fact that 1 billion people are joining the ranks of the middle class. American companies should be selling their products to those people. How can we better capitalize on the growth we're seeing outside of the United States?
Well, the administration has a significant export initiative that is getting underway. In fact, earlier this week, we had a gathering of the export cabinet and many of the private sector folks who are leading the charge on that. I think there are several, look, over the medium to long term, the way we capture more export opportunities is through the typical things that folks always raise, better education system, continued flexibility in our labor markets, and investments in our infrastructure. In the nearer term, there may be other components. We have several components of the export initiative, including expanded efforts at the Ex-Im Bank, especially for small and medium-sized businesses. One of the things that's fascinating is many small businesses will export, or the small share that do export to only one country. And the question is, can we spread that to a broader base of exporting possibilities? So there's a significant amount of effort, and look, the fact of the matter is exports have contributed, this is stunning, over the past several quarters, exports have contributed as much to economic growth as domestic consumption, which given their shares in GDP is really quite a striking statement.
That's amazing, and it's one reason that everybody's trying to figure out how to continue doing that, selling to people overseas. You're set to leave your post at the end of the month.
I am.
The first cabinet member to leave the administration, certainly the first economic advisors to depart. Is this a testament to how tough things are?
No, I think, look, this is mostly, I had been at CBO for 2 years before taking the OMB job. So I've been in government for almost 4 years, and I think that's enough time.
Has the administration started to work on the budget for the coming year?
A little bit. And that's the other thing. People, I think, were a little puzzled by the timing. One of the things you have to realize about the budget director, as opposed to other members of the economics team or other members of the cabinet, is you can't leave in December. It's not an option. The budget cycle starts picking up in October. It gets very intense in November, December, January, and then it continues through January, February, March. So it's either sort of this summer or next summer.
Right. But people saying, look, you're leaving 17 months into the job, right? And before the administration really gets knee-deep into the coming budget, why leave?
Well, look, the other thing to remember is the median tenure for OMB directors is about 18 months. So this is not, if you look back at the history, this is not unusual. And I had been, again, that's for people who hadn't even had jobs like the CBO one before. As you correctly noted, we had 2 major pieces of legislation during that period, so it wasn't exactly dull.
No.
Look, I think it's just, I know myself well enough to know that when you get burned out, that's the worst time for anyone, and you're more likely to make mistakes. So both for myself and I think for the administration too, it just made sense.
What are your thoughts on post Peter Orszag in the administration?
Peter Orszag 2.0?
Yeah,
or the administration 2.0?
The administration. And when you hear things like, oh, the administration doesn't have anybody with business acumen there, and we really need a little better cooperation between government and business as opposed to, business is evil. What are your thoughts on some of the criticism in that regard?
Well, it's interesting. Look, I don't think you can go through the kind of potential and actual tumult and difficulty that we have been through without tensions flaring. So we should just realize there's no way you're going to experience private sector borrowing going from plus 30% of GDP to minus 11% of GDP, 40% of GDP shift in net private sector borrowing without there being a crucible of tension and high drama. That having been said, I mean, again, if you look at the record with regard to economic activity, things have turned out well, relatively well. With regard to many of the things that could have happened, don't forget there was a debate around this time last year about whether the president should nationalize the banking system. So and he didn't. Automobile industry is actually turning out much better than expected. So there are lots of things that are very actually pro-business that I think don't get remarked upon. That having been said, look, the administration continues to make lots of efforts to reach out to corporate leaders, and I think there is progress that's being made, but I will acknowledge that there has been tension, which I think is understandable given how much what the economy's been through.
After all that you've done and the administration has done, are they now in a lame duck period? I mean, will they be able to actually make a change and card check and climate change? What are your views post-November?
Well, post-November, especially as you move into next year, I think there's significant opportunity for additional legislative activity. It will depend in part on what happens during the elections, or what specific pieces of legislation are most auspicious will depend on what happens during the elections. But no, I don't think, certainly the administration's not a lame duck. I think some people may think I am, but that's a different matter.
Are you expecting the party to lose a lot of seats in November?
I don't do politics.
You don't do politics?
No.
How could you say you don't do? Okay, let's open up to questions. On that note, yes, sir.
John Debs, Palo Alto. Peter, thank you for your great service. My question is, most of the liberal economists today say, look at 37 when they raised taxes, look at Japan when they raised the VAT in the 90s, and it turned out in 2020 hindsight to be a policy mistake. Yet today, I could make the argument, I will make the argument, I want your answer to it or your thoughts, is that the biggest problem we have is confidence right now. Business confidence, consumer confidence, some of the points Maria brought up, and uncertainty over some of these bills, the commission's way out there rather than just taking charge and going for it. But anyways, so is it really better now for the economy going forward to not do more stimulus because that will give business in particular, who has all this cash on their balance sheet, more certainty that they can do more CapEx, whatever else they're going to do to create jobs and grow the economy? So that's my question: is this actually more stimulus here counterproductive because business confidence in particular will actually go down and they'll sit on their hands like they are now?
Sure. Well, I think the short answer is that I would find it highly unlikely that, look, the extenders bill, where most of the, quote, stimulus is contained, net budget impact, net deficit impact is somewhere, depending on House or Senate, $30 to $50 billion. I do not think that business confidence is going to be driven by whether there's an additional net $30 or $50 billion injected. So the short answer is I've seen that argument out there, but especially given the specific pieces of legislation that are being debated, it doesn't seem to me to get at the heart of whether the business confidence questions. In other words, I do think it would be beneficial. Mostly, by the way, I mean, there'd be some benefit for the economy, mostly, frankly, for the people involved. I mean, that bill contains an extension of unemployment insurance benefits, for example. You have 1.5 million people who exhausted their benefits by the end of June, more than 3 million who are going to exhaust by the end of July if no action is taken. So it's more like a relief bill than a stimulus bill.
Okay, so why don't you raise the gasoline tax and pay for it?
So the question was why not raise the gasoline tax and pay for it? And I think the answer is that actually significant parts of that bill are paid for. Again, the net cost is $30 to $50 billion. The gross cost is north of 100. The revenue provisions that are contained in that bill are the carried interest provisions. There's other international tax provisions. So there are a whole variety of revenue proposals that offset the majority of the cost of the bill already.
Why do you think, speaking of confidence, why do you think businesses are not hiring?
Well, again, they are, just not rapidly enough. And I think, and it varies big versus small and medium size. Partly this is understandable. This is a normal part of that three-stage process as you come out of recovery. And partly, again, in terms of confidence, it is understandable that having gone through an experience like we just went through, that businesses are waiting to make sure the economy is durable before taking some of the large cash positions which have built up and increasing domestic investment.
They're still nervous.
I think folks are still, I mean, households are nervous, so there still is some anxiety, and that anxiety will diminish as the recovery continues.
Understood. Yes, sir.
Hello. Hi,
Okay.
Lee McIntyre with the engineering and construction business. And just one comment, we thought the stimulus on the engineering and construction was pretty weak, about $100 billion. Just want to give some feedback back. Didn't stimulate an awful lot of jobs. But also wanted to ask about the debt. You talked about the deficit a lot. On debt, could you comment on, is it something like 70% GNP? Is that, how unhealthy is that? How uncomfortable should we feel about the debt?
It's lower than 70% now. It will hit the mid-60s to something like 70% by the middle to latter part of the decade. And this is publicly held debt net of financial assets, which I think is the best concept to use. Look, something in that range by historical experience should be fully sustainable. I think the danger is we don't want to continue debt increasing, especially far beyond those levels, because you don't know where the threshold is when investor confidence flips. So I know lots of folks have tried to define it's at 85%, it's at 90%, it's at 72%. I don't think we actually, I think that's based in part on psychology and becomes self-fulfilling, and so it's impossible to define. But most economists, I think, would think that as long as we stabilized at, you know, debt as a share of the economy at, say, mid-60s or maybe even at 70, that's okay. We don't want to go, we certainly don't want to be going, we don't want to be on a path where it just continues to increase with no end in sight. That's the most important thing.
Right here. Okay, it's fine.
Bill Oberdorf, San Francisco. Again, you've provided great service to the country, Peter. And when we look at the period of time when the $787 billion stimulus plan was passed, it was a point in time in crisis. We are fortunately beyond that, but the economy does appear to still be slow.
Yes.
So what is the likelihood that we're going to see have to have another stimulus plan of significant size? And what is the likelihood, if there is, that it's not going to be about unemployment extension benefits and really about making investments in the economy, such as our infrastructure?
Great question.
Yeah, let me answer that in two ways. First, I think there is very little appetite right now for a massive new additional stimulus effort, and that is unlikely to happen. Look, if the economy really started, if we were experiencing minus 6% GDP growth again, the political economy can shift, but right now in the Congress, basically none. And in fact, there's even debate over whether much smaller packages will be enacted, which I think it would be unfortunate if not. Now on the infrastructure, let me also come back to the construction point before. One of the things that is in tension is that infrastructure spending typically spends out relatively slowly compared to other types of measures that can be enacted. There were, and frankly, I think the Recovery Act actually demonstrates this. There were lots of claims that were made that there were all these shovel-ready projects. There's been a lot of effort put into getting the money out the door rapidly, and it's still the case that the initial projections from CBO, which suggested slower spend-out rates, have proven to be basically right. So the benefit of infrastructure spending is you wind up with an asset that is productive over time. The cost, at least from a short-term economic recovery perspective, is that it often doesn't get injected into the economy as rapidly as one would like because of permitting, because of planning, and a whole variety of other reasons.
George Goldsmith, Tapestry Networks in New York. I wanted to get your view. At the very beginning, you talked about the swing that the healthcare legislation will provide on the deficit. And you referred to the challenges of implementing healthcare legislation. I'm wondering if you could pick the top two and then suggest how they might be addressed.
Yeah, the top two from the perspective of deficit reduction over time are the excise tax, which will gradually apply to a larger and larger share of health insurance plans, and secondly, the Payment Advisory Board, which we've already discussed. On the excise tax, let's just deal with the sort of skepticism that exists. It doesn't take effect until 2018. So a lot of people have said, oh, please, yes, if it's implemented, it'll have that effect. But in 2017, Congress is going to repeal it. Here's why I think that that's unlikely to be the case, but we could all gather again in 2018 and see whether I'm right or not. The reason I think that's not going to be the case is threefold. First, if you look at the history of lagged implementation, it's actually pretty positive. So for example, the most recent Social Security normal benefit age, full benefit age, increasing gradually over time. The implementation was delayed. It actually took effect. Most of the things that are delayed for several years actually do take effect because the default has been shifted. Second, by 2017 or 2018, we will still have, and especially if these fiscal projections turn out to be right, and we're not at 0, but we're at 5% of GDP or more, the pay-go rules will be there. And in order to repeal the tax in 2017, you'd have to offset a decade's worth of revenue or waive the rules, both of which would be awkward. And then finally, noting the first 2 points, if I were a CEO, and most of the folks that I'm talking to are already incorporating this into their thinking, seeing that there's some significant probability that tax will actually take effect in 2018, well before that, I would start redesigning my health plan in order to come in under the threshold. And to the extent that that happens, it ironically alleviates the perceived political need to repeal the tax in the first place. It also, by the way, raises revenue ahead of 2018, because as firms redesign their health plans, more compensation goes into taxable wages away from tax-preferred health care, and revenue is raised as wages go up, which, by the way, was where the majority of the projected revenue from this tax came from. It was not collected from, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, not projected to be collected from insurance companies, but rather from the effect of companies responding to the incentives contained in from that tax to design more efficient healthcare plans and having higher wages as a result.
But isn't that part of the issue in terms of creating an extra cost, an expectation of an extra cost, and perhaps holding back hiring on the part of those CEOs? I mean, if those CEOs are saying, look, I know that I'm faced with higher costs, and maybe I'm not going to see that expense next year, but I'm certainly not going to, back up the truck and add new heads to the payroll, knowing that I do have this higher expense, even if they're just anticipating it. Doesn't that dictate behavior? Yeah, although in this case, what they're doing is there may be other provisions or other policies that speak to that. But in this case, what they're doing is they're redesigning their healthcare plans in order to reduce the cost of the health plan. So it goes in the, and then as a result, they can afford to pay higher wages even while keeping compensation constant. Yes, sir.
Normalized average new home sales were about 1.5 million units a year. During the tax credit period, they were maybe 500, 600,000. Latest number was 300,000. Weekly mortgage application figures for new home purchases of home are down 25 to 30% against a year ago, which is a big recession. How do you interpret that? The housing market continues to have problems. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And I think ultimately the thing that will drive the housing market is the strength of the recovery itself. As incomes rise and as people's prospects for future income expands, the housing market will recover. But the facts that you cite just demonstrate continued weakness in the housing sector, period. How long do you expect that to sustain? Well, again, it will depend in part on the strength of the recovery. But what are your expectations? Well, I think most private sector expectations are for something like 3% growth for the rest of this year and into next year. I think that's a reasonable, but certainly the private sector consensus. Yes, sir.
David Nadell from the Royce Funds, New York. I just have a question about servicing our debt and what an acceptable ratio is between tax receipts and debt service. We're in a very low interest rate environment. 2/3 of the world is being given money at 1% or less. But you cited the demographics of an aging population, so lower prospects for revenue. What happens when the Fed realizes that they're creating the next bubble and they jack up interest rates and debt service becomes a problem?
Well, debt service is going to become a growing share of the budget, not just as interest rates increase, which, by the way, one should expect. Even let's take the long end of the bond market. One should expect as the economy recovers. Again, I said earlier, I think people don't realize it. Total private sector borrowing, both financial and non-financial and households, 28% of GDP in 2007. Most recent figures, minus 11%. Non-financial went from 15% of GDP to minus 2. Huge shifts. That is going to change as the economy recovers. Businesses and households are going to start borrowing again. That will put upward pressure on interest rates, especially on the long end of the market. So as the economy recovers, as firms start to invest again more aggressively, you should expect interest rates to increase. The majority of the impact of growing debt burden comes not from that impact, but rather from the fact that debt is rising as a share of the economy. The two exacerbate each other. I don't think there's a particular threshold for what debt service burden as a share of revenue or as a share of the economy should or can be, but rather it's another manifestation of why we need to act sooner rather than later.
We have about 2 minutes left, so we have a few more questions. Yes, sir.
Gordon Siegel, Chicago. Is there really any chance for VAT? They keep talking about it, yet 70% of our economy is driven by consumption.
Yeah.
That would be pretty devastating. So.
Look, the president has been very clear that he does in favor of that. This question has come up in the context of the Fiscal Commission, where we have said, and I will repeat, that we want to let it do its work. So I think I'm just going to leave it at that.
He will not go there.
I'm not going there.
Where else? Right here.
I'd like to get back to the discussion of the debt you're creating based on all these good things you're doing for us. 60 to 65%.
I don't have a good feeling about this.
Creating a debt that you think will stabilize at 65% is outrageous. If you really calculate the interest cost as a percentage of what the government expenditures would be at that time, it's out of sight. Our debt has never been more than 20 or 25%, except during World War II, right. And we brought it down very rapidly thereafter. What do you think the debt level you're talking about is going to do for the health of this economy? Will we look like Greece?
Look, I think two comments. One, the reason, agree completely, we can have a debate about whether 60 or 65% is catastrophic. I don't think it is. I think what is catastrophic is a path where it's not 60 to 65%, but growing to 100, 150, 200%. Well, I understand that. So the question is, how do you get off of that track? And again, I think we have the nature of the medium-term problem is much different than the nature of the long-term problem. The long-term problem is almost exclusively healthcare costs. And those who are worried about healthcare costs should be the most forceful in favor of very aggressively implementing the provisions that were contained in the Health Act that will help to constrain costs. Again, just don't forget my word. Look at the CBO document that came out. If we reduce the long-term fiscal imbalance by 3% of GDP, that would be a very substantial achievement, more than eliminating the long-term deficit in Social Security, and more than has been done in any other context in many decades. It's not enough, which is why we've set up the Fiscal Commission, but it is substantial. And I'm going to just finish on the notion of this Fiscal Commission. I don't know if you guys know Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, but they are very strongly committed to producing a set of recommendations, and they are very effective people. I find it, so just to come back to the skepticism that surrounded whether the commission is going to do anything, I'm willing to put my money on Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson.
No, they have said that the healthcare reform will balloon the deficit over the near term. They have said that.
No, they haven't. No,
they said that on my show.
They haven't quite said that. What they have said is that healthcare costs will balloon the deficit.
They said on my show, I said, is this healthcare bill going to cut the deficit? They said over the near term, it is going to expand the deficit. Now, you said over the long term, it's going to cut. So it's not necessarily contrary to what you said.
If you look at the CBO numbers, the act reduces the deficit over the next decade and by increasing amounts.
Over the next decade.
Thereafter. I will tell a quick Alan Simpson anecdote because I had never met Alan Simpson before, and I hope there are no Rush Limbaugh fans in the audience, but this defines Alan Simpson for me. In his first meeting in the administration when the commission was being set up, he said, you know, I'm really worried I may get attacked by Republicans. And then he started, this was in a setting that you can imagine, he then started telling a joke. He said this guy buys a very expensive car, and he returns it to the car, I mean, in a very formal meeting, I had never seen anyone do this. Guy buys a very expensive car, returns it to the car dealer and says, the radio doesn't work. And the dealer says, no, you don't understand. You've bought such a wonderful car. All you have to do is articulate what you want, and it comes on the radio. So you say jazz, and on comes the jazz station. You say country music, on comes the country music station. Guy's very excited. He says, that's great. Drives off the lot. Someone cuts him off, and he says, jerk, and on comes Rush Limbaugh.
On that note, Peter Orszag, thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.